Well, hello everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us for our first coffee club session of the new academic year. My name's Laura. A few of you have been on these before and would have been introduced by Becky, our lovely Becky, who's no longer with us anymore. But she has joined us today for the session. I can see her waving at the top. So my name's Laura. So I'm here to help with any technical difficulties you may have, or any questions that you may want to ask that you don't want to ask out loud. You can pop them in the chat and I can put them forward for you. We're going to start with Lorraine from Minerva, who's going to kick off the presentation for you. If there is any questions, there will be some time at the end. If there is anything you think of that you would like me to ask, then just pop them in the chat as Lorraine is talking, and then I can put them forward at the end. I'm now going to hand over to Lorraine to kick the session off.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for inviting me along today. As I said to you when we were sort of planning this, I always enjoy imparting some knowledge, and hopefully today will be helpful for the people that are watching. So as you've said, if anyone's got any questions, feel free, please, to send them in the box, and we will get them answered for you. So what I've just been asked to cover today is a little bit around some procurement guidance, and one of the things we thought would be really good to talk about, bearing in mind that we're at the beginning of the academic year, is to talk about timing when it comes to procurement, because there is, as it says on the heading on my slide, it's all in the timing. And one thing I've learned over many years of providing procurement support for schools, academies, MATs, is that often people seriously underestimate the amount of time it takes to run a good, robust procurement process. So I'm hoping that today I'll be able to give you a few pointers that will help you along your way and help you avoid any pitfalls. So what I'm just going to cover is some procurement approaches. So what different approach do you need to take depending on what sort of value your tender has, what we call below threshold timetable, and an above threshold timetable. So just to give you a couple of draft timetables to give you some clues on what you ought to be thinking about, and then a sort of top 5 tips, things to remember when you're planning your timetables. If there's 5 things I think that you ought to consider or remember that you take away from this, it would be these. So there are different approaches depending on obviously what the value of your tender is. So just need to have a think about what that value is, and therefore what approach you should be taking with your procurement. And that is driven by the value of what you're actually procuring. And so I've popped a slide in here that gives you the current values for different, basically for contracts that breach the public contracts regulations threshold. So essentially, if you're below the figures that are detailed on that slide there, then you need to really look at your own internal financial regulations and say, what does that tell us that we need to do? So usually spend up to 5k, and I'm just generalizing here, so it may be different for your own school or trust, so you need to look at your own regulations, but generally speaking, spend up to £5,000 is sort of deemed as low value, and that's usually that it just needs school approval. So you need to sort of provide some sort of evidence that you've got best value. So that might just be getting some quotes from a catalogue, or looking at the internet, or maybe just getting a couple of fairly basic quotes from potential providers. If you're between sort of 5 and 75,000, that's usually deemed as a sort of medium value procurement. And so with that sort of thing, again, you need to consider what your own internal financial regulations say. But usually with that sort of level, and really anything up to the public contracts regulations threshold, you're going to be running a more robust procurement process. So not just a sort of 3 quotes, but probably something a lot more detailed, asking for a lot more information, a lot more thorough than what you would do if it was below the sort of £5,000 mark. And we call that a request for proposal, but there's lots of different terms you can use, request for quotes, but we call it a request for proposal. So it's a more complex, it's a more formal tender process that you're using. The other option for that sort of level is to use a framework. There's lots of frameworks out there that you can use. So that's another option, another sort of route to market that you can use. So what we're talking about here is I've just kept it really simple today as above threshold and below threshold. So if you go above the limits that are on my slide there for those different areas, then you need to run a process that is compliant with the public contracts regulations, or you know that could include using a framework, which frameworks are compliant with the public contracts regulations. So that's another route to market for you. But it's important to note that the figures that I've quoted there are including VAT. That is a change. When they changed the thresholds earlier on this year, that they did actually change it to be including VAT. So just make sure that when you're looking at your contract value, you consider the amount of VAT that may be payable on that contract as well, and include that in the value. And the other point to note when you're calculating the value is make sure that you're looking at the whole life value of the contract. So these figures here aren't an annual value, they are the value of the whole life of the contract. So if you were looking at a 3-year contract, then you need to take your annual value, multiply it by 3. If you're looking at a 3-year contract, but there's 2 optional extensions maybe, so you could go into year 4 or 5 and extend, you must include those optional extensions as well when you're calculating the value. So in that case, if it was a 3 + 1 + 1, as we call it, then you would need to look at the annual value and multiply that by 5 and then add the VAT if that's applicable. That's how you calculate your values. So there's 2 different approaches. As I say, I'm going to keep it fairly simple today and just talk about above and below threshold. It's a little bit more complex than that, but we haven't got too much time today, so just wanted to make that distinction really. So this is an example of a below threshold timetable. So as you can see, this is looking at a 1st of April 2023 start date. So that's we were looking at here for a client who wants to start their new contract at the start of the Easter break, which is a good time to look at it. One thing I would say is if you can avoid 1st of September start dates, I would. I know it makes a lot of sense in many cases. It's the start of an academic year, and in the case of academies, it's the start of a financial year, but everybody's trying to do the same. And what that means is that you're running your tender process at the same time as everybody, and you're starting your contract at the same time as everybody. And often that means that the suppliers are incredibly stretched. They've only got a certain amount of resource themselves. They might start cherry picking which bids they're going to bid for and not. So if you can take your contract renewal date to a different time period, maybe Easter or a half-term break, it does make sense to do so. So in this instance, we were looking at a below threshold and for a 1st of April start date. So as you can see here, even for a 1st of April start date for a below threshold, we're looking at the checklist to be provided by our client by the 3rd of October. And that's essentially saying to us that we need to have that information so that we can write all of the tender documents. And we give ourselves around about 3 weeks from when we get the checklist to issuing the documents. So I think the key thing here is to say, please allow yourself lots of time to collate the information at the beginning of your tender process, because it's surprising how long it takes to gather. And it's a really important, it's a little bit like that thing where you talk about computers, garbage in, garbage out. If you provide, very sparse information, if it doesn't include details of what you really want, you will get a contract with a supplier, but it might not be what you wanted. Make sure you include times for things like site visits. I think in this instance, I've got site visit actually happening the same day as the tender was issued. I only just noticed that. I think that must have been because whatever we were tendering here didn't involve a site visit. So it would have been probably something like payroll or maybe audit services, something that doesn't require a visit. But obviously, if you've got something like catering or cleaning or ICT managed services, then a site visit would be appropriate. Allow some time for bidders to ask questions and for you to respond to them. And again, give the bidders a fair chance. If you want to get a quality bid in from them, then give them ample time to pull together a decent bid. That little bit that's boxed off in the timetable there is 42 days, and that's normally what we would suggest is a good time period for the bidders to have ample time to ask their questions and pull their bid together. Do make sure you give yourself plenty of time to score the bids when they come in. If you're doing something more formal where there's some sort of evaluation, I've seen tenders before where schools have said, oh, they've got the bids in on a Friday and somehow they've evaluated it by the Monday. Not only does that involve someone working at the weekend, which I don't suppose anyone would be happy with, but it's just simply not enough time to do it. Don't make life difficult for yourself. Give yourself a good 2 or 3 weeks to make sure that you've got time to evaluate properly, because you may have queries that you need to go back to the bidders. Invariably, they make mistakes in their bids when they put them in, or there's things you need to clarify because you don't understand. And if you've not given yourself enough time, you put yourself under unnecessary pressure. And as we all know, in a school environment, there's always a mini crisis, or sometimes even a major crisis around the corner, which will prevent you from doing what you want to do when you want to do it. So don't sort of make it difficult for yourself. Allow yourself plenty of time. If you need to have a presentation day, make sure you've allowed time for that. I'd give the bidders at least a week's notice of a presentation day, longer if possible, especially if it's catering, because they need time to get a team together, order the food, and etc. for a catering presentation day. And then obviously look at providing the bidders with a notice of intent to award. So let them know who's been successful, and then allow a period of time for mobilisation. Couple of points on that. Don't forget to allow some time between the decision being made. Perhaps it might even be made on the presentation day, or you might need some clarifications afterwards. But often you'll need to get sign off from someone for that decision. So don't forget to allow some time for that, or at the very least, put those decision makers on notice that you're going to be asking them for a decision. And allow lots of time for the mobilisation. The more time you can allow for mobilisation, the better. But certainly if it's something like that involves labour, catering, cleaning, that type of service, there's going to be TUPE consultations. There may even be an LGPS element that needs to be done, and you need to get your legal agreement signed off as well. So generally speaking, it's a minimum of 30 days, I would say, from when you've made the decision to the contract commencing. But if you can make it longer, like in this instance that we've given 67 days, that's going to help both you and the contractor. So there's a few points I've made in there that actually are relevant for an above threshold timetable. But this is more complex because it's generally speaking a 2-stage process. So stage 1 is the selection questionnaire stage, and it kind of looks backwards. So it looks at the contractor themselves and starts to look at their capability and their capacity to actually deliver your contract. And then you'd move into a second stage, which is called the invitation to tender. And that then looks forward. So that will actually look at how those bidders that are shortlisted would actually be able to deliver your service. So again, I've given a suggested timetable here. This one, if I just move on a couple of slides, you'll see that this is for a 1st of August 2023 start date. So I couldn't actually fit this timetable all on one slide. It had to go across 3 slides, otherwise you'd never been able to read it. But you can see that even for a 1st of August start date for next year, I'm still suggesting here that the checklist needs to be back from our client by the 25th of November, and the contract notice needs to be published by December. What this is doing, again, is giving lots of time. It's allowing some contingency. It's also ensuring that you're ahead of the game in terms of other schools, maybe, because if they don't start their tender processes till February time, then actually you're ahead, and the bidders are already bidding on your opportunity. So they're less likely to be going and looking at others. So the sooner you can start, the better. You'll see in there that the selection questionnaire stage needs to be a minimum of 30 days. That's if it's done electronically. So that's important to note that when it's above threshold, there will be some compliance elements to the timetable that you'll need to consider, like the SQ stage being open for 30 days. Similarly, the invitation to tender stage must be issued and open for a minimum of 10 days. But again, like the request for proposal timetable I had before, I'd normally suggest it's not any less than 42 days, because trying to get bidders, you know, to pull a bid together in 10 days for something as complex as your catering tender, for example, is really setting them up to fail, and you don't want to do that. So I would recommend, again, that sort of section is around about 42 days. Again, allow yourself plenty of time to analyse your bids when they come in. Ample time for the presentation day to be sort of organised and held. So again, very similar to the request for proposal, but it's just that this is 2 stages. Hence, although we're starting only a little bit after the RFP timetable I gave you, we're finishing a lot later as a result of that. Also, with the above threshold, you will find that you need to issue a notice of intent to award, but you'll also need to hold a 10-day standstill period. So once that notice of intent to award has been issued, the next day is the first day of the standstill period, and you must allow a minimum of 10 days. And you'll notice here that actually there's 13 days in our 10-day standstill period. That's because it was due to end on Monday the 29th of May, or it was due to end on a Saturday actually, and it can't end on a Saturday, a Sunday, or a bank holiday. It needs to be a working day, so hence it's a little bit longer than the normal 10 days. That's to ensure that bidders have the opportunity, if they want to challenge anything about the tender process, that they can do so. And you'll see again that the decision on this one is made in May, and the contract doesn't actually start until the 1st of August. But again, lots of time for mobilisation to take place, TUPE consultations, LGPS, and so on. And so it just gives you more time. It also means the decision's made before the end of the summer term in readiness for the start of the next academic year. So just finally, because I'm conscious of time, some top 5 tips when planning your timetable. I think I've covered most of these, I think, already. Make sure you leave plenty of time for the information gathering at the start of the process. It's really critical to make sure that you provide detailed information, not only about your current service provision, but about what you would like going forwards. To maximise the number and the quality of the bids you receive, remember that suppliers also need lots of time to complete a detailed and accurate submission for you. So don't make it too difficult for them either, because actually the other thing is that if they think that there's not sufficient time, they probably just won't bid, because they're all incredibly busy too, and they might look at it and say, well, there's not enough time to pull a decent bid together, we're not going to bid. So to maximise the number that you get and the quality, allow bidders plenty of time as well. Allow ample time for the evaluation and moderation of your bids when you get them in. Don't give yourself just a couple of days. It could be quite complex. There's probably going to be errors by the bidders that you'll need to clarify. And it's not an easy process to go through. You might want to evaluate and then someone else moderate, for example. So someone else is actually having a look at the scores that you've awarded. So again, allow plenty of time for that. We usually allow at least 3 to 4 weeks for that part of the process. Plan ahead for any sign-offs. So if you've got governors or trustees or the principal or someone who's maybe not involved in the process needs to sign off any decision, then make sure that you've planned ahead for that, either to allow some time for them to review it or to have put them on notice that you'll be needing a decision from them so they're aware. And then my final tip is don't forget the legal requirements. So look at things like TUPE consultations. That needs to be a minimum of 30 days. If there's LGPS involved, you might need admitted body status. You'll need to get the legal agreement signed off. So there's lots of things that can take an awful lot of time. I mean, if I tell you that we normally get the bunting out if we've managed to sign a legal agreement before the contract actually starts, that will probably tell you that it's not as easy as you would think. So yeah, so that's my top tips. I'm not going to go through this slide, but I know you probably will have access to the slides. So there's just some contact details on there that you can jot down a note. And there's also, and I know this is coming out in the follow-up email, we've got a download on our website, 84 points for a perfect procurement process, which you can download, which has got a lot more information in there. I'm conscious I've really rushed through that, but I know we're a bit, tight for time. So, and I wanted to allow lots of time for questions. And obviously, I'm now going to hand over because Naomi is going to do her presentation. So I'm going to stop presenting and give control to Naomi, I think.
Before we hand over to Naomi, is there anybody that does have any questions for Lorraine at all?
Stunned into silence, Laura. Oh, look at that going, oh my gosh.
Oh yes, Lizzie, we do have a question from Lizzie.
Yes, I've just two-paid over some employees that were employed by NG, our previous cleaning company, to our new cleaning company, and they are having to link to the West Yorkshire pension scheme. So an estimate was provided. They're saying that we have to pay for that estimate. Is that correct? Or should they be paying for it?
It really depends on what was in your tender documents. If you didn't indicate anywhere that the contractor was responsible for that cost, then they won't have factored that into their pricing, and their expectation will be that you will pay that. So you need to make sure when you are writing your documentation that any costs that you're expecting the contractor to pick up, that you make it very clear that is their responsibility. If it was indicated in the documents that that was the case, then yes, they were made clear at the outset, and they should have allowed for that. And if they've forgotten to allow for that in their pricing, that's up to them. Ultimately, I think with things like that, you will end up paying for it somewhere. There's no doubt about it. If they don't put it in as a specific cost in their P&L that they send to you, they've probably factored it into the management fee somewhere. So sometimes it's just easier to just suck it up and pay it yourself and then know that it's done. Other times, if you prefer to have it, actually taken up in and included in their pricing, so it's very related to the cleaning, then that's another approach. But always go back to what's in the tender document. If you haven't articulated that anywhere in the documents, then unfortunately they probably are going to be expecting you to pay that. Sorry, probably not the answer that you're wanting, but
Thank you. Is there anyone else before we move on to Naomi? Okay, take it away, Naomi.
Morning, everyone. So I haven't prepared a presentation for you guys because I thought I'd just give you a quick few hints and tips from an ICT procurement perspective. So just going on the back of timings, which I think links in well with Lorraine's presentation. Thank you for that, Lorraine. The contracts renewals that we have here at SBS, so that could be anything from your online backups, your Microsoft licensing, your Impero licenses. I would just stress to make sure you check your anniversary dates for renewals. If you're not too sure when your dates are, send me a quick email and I'll be happy to send you over what contracts you've got, when they start, when they expire. The SLAs that we send over for some contracts, such as your online backup, I would also make sure you read through them, because in them it does state that they are automatically renewed. So unless you give 90 days notice, it will get renewed straight away on your anniversary date. And unfortunately, once that's been renewed, we then can't undo that, because obviously the procurement process has already happened. And just another point, where possible, I would advise to sign up for a 3-year contract, especially with your Microsoft licensing, because Microsoft tend to honour the 3 years at the same price. So as soon as you say, yep, I want that for 3 years, that will lock in, and every year it will be the same price, rather than, oh, I'll do a year and then next year you're paying more. If you lock in for the 3 years, it will still get invoiced annually, so you won't be paying out the whole 3 years straight away. It's just that we'll invoice you every year at that same cost. So that's on contract renewals. Just to another few hints and tips. When it comes to your actual hardware purchasing, I would advise to bulk purchase where possible. So for instance, if you're in a multi-school trust or in a federation, you can bulk up with your other team up with the other teams within your trust, because then sometimes you get a price point with hardware. So if you say you order 10 items, it'll be X amount. If you order 20, it'll be even cheaper, things like that. And also do push back when you think the price is too high, because more often than not, resellers don't like to lose a sale to another competitor, so they will bring back their costs. If I ever send you over a quote and you think, oh, that's a bit high, but we do want to go with you, then of course push back, and I will do as much as I can possible to push back on our suppliers too. And also, don't just go for the cheapest. I know budgets are tight, however, if you purchase cheap, it is more than likely that you'll need to replace it, so it will cost you twice as much in the future than it would in the first instance. Yeah, that's really my hints and tips from an ICT procurement side of things. Sorry that it's quite short, but didn't really know what else to bring to the guys. But if there's any questions, then please obviously pop it in the chat or feel free to ask, and I shall answer them as well as I can.
Thank you, Naomi. Is there anyone that has any questions at all for Naomi?
Look at that, it must be really good.
We do have some typing going on in the chat, So bear with.
Just pop it open.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Naomi, because what you're saying is very similar to what I was saying, which is just, I think it's all about planning ahead, isn't it? And just having those thoughts early. I know when you come back at the start of an academic year, I think particularly for academies, they're very focused on the audit that's coming up and that sort of thing. But actually thinking ahead a little bit and deciding maybe before you finish the end of the last term. I know it sounds awful to have to be thinking about the following academic year. You probably don't want to think about it till you come back, but it's just to try and make your life easier, really, that you're not up against it all the time.
Yeah, definitely.
We do have a couple of questions. So the first one is from Becky. What's the state of back orders for tech since the pandemic?
That's a good one. So with your day-to-day things such as like laptops, PCs for your ICT suites, screens, they tend to be on a next day or 1 to 2 days. So they are a quick turnaround. With more, let's say, robust things such as switches for your Wi-Fi, you're looking at probably, well, put it this way, I've got some orders that were the end of last year and they're still not being filled because things like HP and Ubiquiti, they're just struggling at the minute. So I would say if you're getting new Wi-Fi or switches installed, then if you're looking to do it for summer, I definitely would recommend getting it in now, at least getting your quote over. Thanks, Becky.
Is there still an issue with things like reprographics devices and things, Naomi? Because I know there's obviously been this issue with chips, hasn't there, that they can't actually get chips. So a lot of the things that you would normally expect to not have that long a lead-in time are, reprographics would be a good example of that. But I'm guessing other aspects of what you're doing are being affected, aren't they?
Yeah, so it is the chip that goes into it that's not being, I don't know if they're not making it anymore or what, but there are some switches, but again, obviously it's the more expensive ones that they want to get out the door. However, they do come in drips and drabs, so it's almost a case of if it comes in that day, you need to order it that day, otherwise they're going to be gone. So it's a nightmare.
And
Be quick.
Lorraine, in the chat. So we've got a question for payroll tender. Any advice on the time frame for a 50 grand?
Yeah, so if it's
tender?
50,000 per annum, then that's going to more than likely breach the threshold. If it's 50,000 for the whole term of the contract, then obviously that will be below threshold. What I would say with payroll tenders is if you revert back to the timetables that I've given, it's going to be broadly similar for payroll. But I would strongly urge you to allow a lot longer for the final part of it around the implementation for two reasons. Firstly, you'll need to look at doing parallel runs. So a parallel run is where the incoming provider will run your payroll in parallel with your existing provider. And what that allows them to do then is check whether there's errors or omissions. It's interesting because there's been a slight shift from that, and we do have a couple of payroll providers now who don't do parallel runs. I think, unfortunately, because what they've discovered is that the data from the incumbent is often so corrupt, effectively, that there's no point in trying to replicate, because all you're doing is replicating mistakes. And so therefore what they prefer to do is not do a parallel run and then run it clean from the data that they've had as part of the implementation process. So I think I would recommend allowing probably a good 3 months from when you've awarded the contract to have what I would term as an implementation phase of 3 months, which is where you're planning and doing your data cleansing and getting everything ready, and then have what I would call an operational services start date. So you'd have an implementation or a mobilization phase of, say, 3 months, and then you'd have an operational services phase, which is where the payroll then goes live. So I think certainly really plan ahead for that. if you're looking at an April start, because I know a lot of people want to have it in alignment with the start of the tax year, you need to be even more organised than that, because a lot of the payroll providers get very busy for that period, and some of them will actually shut up shop and say we're not taking on any more clients for that particular date. September's, again, sort of seems to make sense at the start of academic year, but in reality, that's when you have more changes than at any other time in terms of personnel and payroll. So again, it's worth considering whether you really want to do a September start with all those changes happening in month one. Plus, if you've had some training on how to use a new system, you'd have had to have had that probably prior to the end of the summer term. You've then got the whole of the summer where some people will be off, and they'll come back in September and probably have completely forgotten what you've trained on earlier on. So again, not necessarily a great time. So hopefully a few hints there in terms of not just the timings, but actually the date of when you want the contract to commence as well. Hopefully that's helpful for you, Marwa.
We've got a question from Nicola, which I think is going to fall into sort of what you were just discussing. So if you enter a service contract for something, but you don't want to be continually amending the contract, what duration do you use to work out the value over the life of the contract?
So yeah, if you're not wanting to chop and change, then it's okay with the public contracts regulations. You do have regulation 72 will allow you to actually make changes to your contract without having to rerun a tender. So a good example of that would be if, when you're talking about changing, for example, if you were part of a multi-academy trust and then you had another school join your trust, obviously there's going to be an additional value then added to that contract. You can add up to 50% of the value of the original tender without having to do a retender. Obviously, I would always recommend in those scenarios that you just speak to your legal advisors to make sure that you're not going to breach any of the regulations. But generally, that regulation 72 will allow you to make amendments to your contract. To me, it's very generous, a 50% increase. And it's not an aggregate either. So you can actually, once you've done that 50% increase, your new contract value is the new value. And so you can then do another 50% and another 50%. So actually, there's quite a lot of flex within the regulations to allow you to make those changes. So if you do add other services, for example, to what you've already procured, so if for example it was payroll and you added a HR element, or if you added a new school and therefore you've got more cost because there's more pay slips, you generally speaking, at the level we're talking, you won't be breaching any regulations if you do that. But as I say, always seek some legal advice, just to be absolutely sure. But hopefully that helps, Nicola.
Sorry, could I just come in then with a question? I mean, what I'm uncertain of is, how do I determine how many years, if I want to do a new payroll contract, how do I, realistically, I'd like to just put them in place and keep them and not have to keep, going out to tender again,
yeah,
because it's a lot
okay.
of work to cut over. What do
Yeah.
I say is my duration? Because that then tells me whether I'm within or outside certain limits.
Yeah, I mean, what you need to do is, if it's a contract which is going to run in perpetuity, so in other words, when you get to the end of that contract term, you're going to have to retender. Generally speaking, I would recommend going down the public contracts regulations route, because that will give you much greater flexibility, and it will allow you to actually tender for longer. Without that necessity to constantly retender. If you tried to go and do it a below threshold and you only did it for 3 years because you didn't want to breach the contract, in reality, when you get into year 4, you've breached the value anyway. So I would normally recommend our contracts generally, for whatever we do, are a 3+1+1. So we'd say minimum of 3 years with 2 optional extensions of a year each, up to 5 years. However, I've done a tender recently for a catering contract where we did let me get this right, and I'm going to add it. So it was a 3+1+1+1+1. So it still gave them the flex to get out of the contracts in the latter years, but it was in total a 7-year contract that the school actually undertook. So give yourself as much flexibility as you can. Normally I'd say an initial term most bidders will be looking for a minimum of 3 years, although again, I have seen some where it's been 2 and then the extensions thereafter are optional. As you rightly say, you don't want to be doing this every 5 minutes, so the longer you can have the contract in place, the better. Running a tender process which is above threshold isn't a huge amount of additional work in comparison to running one that's below threshold. Although it's 2 stages, a lot of the information that you're gathering and a lot of the information you'll be asking the bidders is going to be the same. And you can, as I mentioned earlier, also use a framework, which is will just be a 1-stage process, and that would be compliant with the regulations as well. So there's various options open to you, but I think if you think you're getting near the threshold, I would recommend running an above threshold process to make sure that you don't fall foul of the regulations.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay. Are there any other questions that anybody has for Lorraine or Naomi? Okie dokie. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I will be sending out a recording of the session along with some details on how you can contact Lorraine and some other details as well for Naomi. If there are any questions that anybody thinks of, when I send out that email, you are more than welcome to respond with any further questions that you may have, that you may think of later on today. And we'll be happy to get those answered for you. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Brilliant.
And have
Thanks,
a lovely
everyone.
rest of the week.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Hello.